Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to all of you. Welcome to Conversations. This is the second edition in the special Ramadan 2024 series, in which I'm basically introducing to you a book from classical Islamic thought, which I think is one of the gems of Islamic intellectual heritage. So in the first episode, we talked about Muqaddimah, the book written by the great Muslim thinker Ibn Khaldun. For our next book, before that, I would like to thank the Islamic Community Center of Lancaster for co-hosting this event, and also a couple of Khans, Wasim Khan and Raza Khan, for buying these books for me. These are expensive books, and I really appreciate the fact that they have sent this to me. So the next book that I want to talk about is the book in Arabic is called Fasl Al-Maqal, by the great Islamic philosopher, thinker, jurist, and also a medical doctor, Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd lived more or less in the 12th century. He died in 1198. And I remember 800 years of his death anniversary. I was in the United States studying doing my PhD in international relations and Islamic political thought at Georgetown University. And I remember writing an essay for the Islamic Horizon, the magazine, about Ibn Rushd, his ideas and his work and his impact. Ibn Rushd is considered as one of the fathers of the modern Renaissance. His books and his philosophical work and his scientific work has had a huge impact on Europe during the Renaissance. In fact, Ibn Rushd contributed in basically, you could say, three broad areas: in the arena of philosophy, in the arena of medicine, and also in Islamic law. So his book on Bidayat al-Mujtahid, which is about the differences in Islamic jurisprudential schools, is an important book written by a Maliki scholar. Ibn Rushd was judge of Seville and then later Cordoba for nearly 10 years. He was very close to the caliphs in Spain, and he advised them regularly on legal and philosophical matters. His book on medicine, he was also a court physician for many years. His book called Kulliyat fi Tib, this book was taught in medical schools in Europe for several centuries, and in fact, in some universities in Latin America, it was taught until the 19th century, for nearly 600-700 years. Imagine how complicated and sophisticated the quality of that book was. Kulliyat fi Tib. There are many articles about Ibn Rushd's impact on Enlightenment thinking, primarily because of his commentaries on Aristotle. So Ibn Rushd wrote commentaries on all books written by Aristotle except Politics, which he did not have. He wrote on various books written by Aristotle, including Plato's Republic. And he wrote three levels of commentaries: short commentaries, intermediate level, and those long exegetical style commentaries, which commented line by line by line. And those who are students of Ibn Rushd's philosophical contributions argue that there is a lot of original thought in the long commentaries of Aristotle. So basically, many Muslim scholars and most European scholars understood and studied Aristotle through Ibn Rushd and his commentaries. And there are huge discussions. Thomas Aquinas spent a lot of time criticizing and agreeing and disagreeing with Ibn Rushd on many other issues, including something which became very famous in Europe called the double truth theory, which I think is a misunderstanding of Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd has a huge impact in the West. Unfortunately, his impact in the Muslim world was not as much, because there is an antipathy to intellectual thought, to scientific research, to philosophical thinking in the Muslim world. And the ulama and the religious scholars often would declare people who were moving away from consensus as heretical, and that was always something scary. So we all are familiar with what happened to Mansur al-Hallaj. And so this violent streak with which sometimes Muslim scholars who tended to disagree with the broad consensus among the religious scholars caused a lot of problems. So anyway, Fasl Al-Maqal is a very, very important book. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I think that all of you should read it. American Muslims should actually buy this book. It is a very interesting edition by the by the university in Utah, Brigham Young University. They have produced several classics from the Islamic heritage in translation. And what I like about these books are I sometimes use passages from this for my graduate students, and including conducting exams on a couple of occasions for PhD students who needed to get to pass Arabic exams. So it has Arabic on one side, as you can see, and English on the other. So you can read, if you can, then you can read both the original text as well as you can then go ahead and read his translation. This is Charles Butterworth's translation. Charles is a very good friend of mine. He was on Conversations talking about Al-Farabi. I will post a link to that video. You can see it after this if you like. But before we talk about Fasl Al-Maqal and what it tried to do and why it's very important, I want to give a context to it. So after Ghazali wrote a book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, that is the incoherence of philosophers, there was basically an attempt to delegitimize the study of philosophy and even logic. Even Ibn Taymiyyah, a prominent Salafi scholar, criticized logic and wrote a treatise against logic, which was actually quite logical in its style, actually. But anyway, so there was this whole debate going on, especially in the western part of the Islamic world, especially in Andalusia in Spain, about the role and importance and permissibility of philosophy. And so Ibn Rushd essentially responded to Al-Ghazali by writing a book called Tahafut al-Tahafut. So Al-Ghazali wrote this book called Tahafut al-Falasifa. I might do a review of that. I actually did a huge summary of that discussion as part of my dissertation. So in Tahafut al-Falasifa, Al-Ghazali basically criticized philosophers and especially targeted them on their metaphysical theories, and basically essentially said that they were leaving the fold of Islam because they were disagreeing with the consensus on issues of whether God has knowledge of particulars or not, and so on. So basically, the philosophical position on the omniscience of God varied from the theological position. And so Ghazali was very critical of it. And so he basically wrote this book called The Incoherence of Philosophy. And then Ibn Rushd responded by writing a book called The Incoherence of the Incoherence, in which he rebuts Al-Ghazali line by line. So I realized after I bought Tahafut al-Tahafut, this is the one, that you don't need to buy Tahafut al-Falasifa, because if you buy Ibn Rushd, then you get both the books, because he actually quotes Ghazali verbatim, and then he says, so everywhere it goes, Ghazali says, I say, Ghazali says, I say, that's how the whole book proceeds. I guess that is Ibn Rushd's style. His commentaries on Aristotle are also like that, line by line, the way Muslim scholars actually wrote exegesis of the Quran. So coming to Fasl Al-Maqal, this book, it's a very short book. He is trying to say is that Kitab Fasl Al-Maqal, this is like a decisive treatise, a final statement that basically connects and looks at the connection or harmony between philosophy and law and Islamic law. So in the book, there's a lot of discussion about many things. It's a very short manuscript, but there are three things I think that Ibn Rushd tried to accomplish in Fasl Al-Maqal. First, he wanted to make the argument that philosophy is not something un-Islamic outside the fold. And so he says that the purpose of writing this book, Fasl Al-Maqal, is to answer the question whether the study of philosophy is forbidden, permitted, or commanded. So is it haram, or is it halal, or is it something that is fard? It is something that God has demanded that you do. So, for example, God has forbidden that you drink alcohol or eat pork, that is haram. God has permitted you to marry, so it is halal. But God has not commanded you to, God has commanded you to fast in the month of Ramadan. That is what. So in his answer, basically, he's putting philosophy in that category, that it is a command from God that we basically learn and practice philosophy. And how does he do that? The way he does it is very simple, and I will get to that. So that's the first thing. He answers this question, whether philosophy is prohibited, permitted, or commanded. The second thing that he tries to do is tries to explain the philosophical method of thinking as to what it is and why it is okay, and why it's not very different from legal thinking. And basically trying to argue that the philosophical method is just a sister of the legalistic jurisprudential thinking. In fact, if you basically study law, you will realize that while fiqh, which is particular legal rulings, may not be so, but usul al-fiqh, which is essentially epistemology, is a philosophical exercise. And the third thing he tries to do was basically to argue as to why philosophers should not be excommunicated and why they are not heretics because they are practicing philosophy. So what he does is he uses what is called as syllogistic argumentation, where you make two kinds of statements and it follows. So for example, it's like saying men are always tall, and since Khan is a man, Khan must be tall, or Khan is tall. So that kind of logic is called syllogistic logic. So basically what Ibn Rushd does is takes many examples from the Quran and basically shows that the Quran is commanding the believer to reflect on the creation or on the signs of God, and basically saying that these artifacts that you see are reflections of the artisan. So the signs of God are essentially reflections of God himself. And so trying to understand these things are something that the Quran really commands. And the purpose of philosophy is to understand the world, to reflect upon the world, to know about the world. And so he goes on to cite several verses from the Quran. And he does cite the verse 191 from chapter 3. And when I was reading this the first time, I was wondering whether he would cite it or not. And to me, it was very meaningful because I consider these two verses, the 190th verse and the 191st verse, as very important from an epistemological point in the Quran. And I will explain to you why. So basically, he looks at one verse, which is the second verse of chapter 59, in which talks about ulul al-absar, people of vision, and people of reason, and people of thought, and people of understanding. So he picks verses from the Quran like that to basically imply that they are essentially philosophers. So in this verse that I'm going to point out to you, he doesn't cite 190, he just cites 191, in which he's basically saying that 191 is, in my opinion, a definition of the phrase ulul al-absar, ulul al-bab. So in the previous verse, in 190, it says, Inna fi khalqi samawati wal ard wa ikhtilafi al-layli wal nahari la ayatin li ulil al-bab. So what that verse is saying, it says, indeed in the creation of heavens and the earth, and in the alternation of the night and day, there are signs for those of understanding. So basically, it's saying that people who think, people who reflect, people who have knowledge, people who have understanding, they can see this day and night, the creation, the heavens, the knowable world, and the unknown. They look at it and they can understand. There are signs for them to understand. So it's basically saying that people who are ulul albab are capable of inferring things from what they observe. And that is the scientific method. And so the next verse, which Ibn Rushd does cite, is, in my opinion, essentially a commentary and an explanation of who are these ulul albab, who are these people of understanding. And it says, Bismillah, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. So that is the key part, who remember Allah while standing or sitting or lying on their sides and give thought to the creation of the heavens and the earth, who do fikr, وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, those who reflect upon the heavens and the earth. So to me, this verse is very important because this verse describes ulul albabs as those who are philosophical as well as mystical, because they remember God all the time. They're doing zikr of Allah all the time, who remember Allah while standing, sitting, or lying on their side. If you were to ask Ibn Arabi would probably tell you that Ibn Rushd would miss the first part of it because he was so focused on justifying the philosopher and the philosophical method that he would miss the first part. الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ, but focus on يَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, so that they reflect on the heavens and the earth. So he takes verses like this and makes the argument that clearly the Quran has commanded, the Islamic law, the Sharia commands that we try to understand the world by observing is the signs that are out there. In fact, there are enough verses. While writing Islam and Good Governance, I had compiled over 170 verses from the Quran. I actually have a list somewhere, which make these kind of commandments. So from there you can see God is talking about historical reasoning. So look at the history, extract and infer conclusions from history about what God is trying to communicate with us. So look at history, look at the celestial being, look at the space, look at the mountains and the rivers, look at the change in day and night and in seasons, etc. So there are a clear encouragement to God, by God, to focus on empirical, historical, as well as rational way of thinking. And that is what philosophy is. And since the law commands you to study philosophy and law cannot be in disharmony. And therefore, within Islamic tradition, Islam and philosophy is therefore in a state of harmony. And then he goes on to try and explain what the Islamic way of thinking. There are several words he uses. One word is obviously hikmah. Hikmah is often translated to mean falsafa or philosophy. But you must understand that Ibn Rushd was Aristotelian, unlike Al-Farabi, who was Platonic. So Al-Farabi's method was deductive reasoning. So he would move from the abstracts to the particulars, whereas Ibn Rushd was Aristotelian. And that's why there is a polemical manuscript that Ibn Rushd wrote criticizing Farabi and even Ibn Sina. So, and then you move from the specifics and particulars to essentially theory building, which is the Aristotelian method. And you take particularities of phenomena, of things much more seriously, properties. And that's why you go into categorization. That's how science emerges. Without Aristotle, we won't have the scientific method or the empirical method. With Plato comes the philosophical method to a great extent. So while discussing these methods, I noticed that some translators often translated some of the words that he was using, such as al-qiyas al-aqli, as syllogistic thinking or intellectual syllogism. That's how Charles Butterworth translates. And I think that when they use such syllogism has a very specific form of logical thinking today. But I think qiyas has a really broader meaning, even though in Islamic legal practice, it means analogical thinking. But I think what Ibn Rushd was trying to do was essentially making the case for the methods for hikmah. And so he was basically arguing when he was trying to defend what he called al-qiyas al-aqli, is an intellectual way of thinking about the signs of God, about the nature and the world. Yes, philosophy has evolved. Today we have postmodern philosophies and deconstruction, archaeology, of things, and so on and so forth. Foucault and Derrida have had huge impact on the evolution of philosophy, and I'm not very sure whether Ibn Rushd would embrace them as hikmah or even al-qiyas al-aqli. But nevertheless, I think what Ibn Rushd, in his discussions, in his methods, was basically defending not only rational thought and rational reasoning from the deductive thinking point of view, but he was also making a case for empirical and scientific thinking. I think we are doing a disservice by translating his work as essentially showing a harmony between just law and philosophy, or between Islamic law and philosophy. But I think what Ibn Rushd was doing was trying to show that not only is it compatible, but God has commanded Muslims to be scientific in their way of thinking, to be rational in their way of thinking, to be philosophical in their way of thinking. And I think that is why this book is so important. The West has benefited more from Fasl Al-Maqal and the arguments that Ibn Rushd has done than unfortunately the Muslim world. And you can see the state of science in the Muslim world reflects that. I was reading Ibn Arabi's account of how he potentially, he met Ibn Rushd only once, but he also saw his body, and he noticed that he died in Morocco, Marrakesh, and he was brought and buried in Cordoba, Spain, and he was brought on a beast of burden. And one side was his body, and on the other side were his books, which were used to balance him. And apparently he was buried with his books because there was a faction among the traditions who were against the study of philosophy, against study of science, metaphysics, and logic in the Muslim world. They wrote books against logic. The third part was basically a defense of philosophers. And the logic is very simple, that God has commanded people to indulge in philosophical thinking. And so when a philosopher speculates, he does not essentially violate the law, so he should not be excommunicated, even when his findings are not consistent with the consensus that existed prior. Otherwise, what is the point of doing independent thinking, right? If you are not looking for alternative ways and expanding what is ijma, or in the consensus. In the book, he also identifies three modes of discourse and thinking. So he says that there are three modes of thinking. One is the most common way of thinking, which is qataba. It's like a rhetorical discourse, which is often employed by preachers and teachers of religion. So poetry is part of it, rhetoric is part of it. And so these are khataba. You're just like giving a discourse, which is very rhetorical. The second way of thinking and speaking is dialectical. He calls it jadal. And that is what he argues is what theologians use. They look at things from very much different perspectives. And then he says the highest form of thinking and speaking, highest mode is Burhan, which is where he comes back to his original concept of al-qiyas al-aqli is essentially necessary because it leads to a logical, philosophical discourse. So rational exposition of things, so putting things together and inferring things together using a reason and then elucidating them. That is Burhan, and he says that is what philosophers do. So this is an important book, even though it's very short. And if you get this version of it, you will have both the Arabic as well as the English version of it. Charles, if you're going to watch this show, thank you very much for translating it. You did a fantastic job. So this is a great book. Ibn Rushd is a great scholar these days in the Muslim world, which is trying to revive itself, especially in the arena of education. It's very important that we go back and look at classics like Muqaddimah, which also emphasize so much on empirical research and rational thinking, and also this book like Fasl Al-Maqal. I have two more books to go in this month of Ramadan, and I'm not going to tell you which ones they are. I hope you look forward to them. Thank you for watching Conversations. And if you have enjoyed this, do subscribe to Conversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share it with your socio-political network and with your friends, especially students and graduate students who may or may not be directly interested in Islamic philosophy, but are studying the Muslim world or Islamic thought in some other form. And do, if you find time, definitely read Fasl Al-Maqal. It is easy for those of you who are here, especially if your main language is English, because there are wonderful translations available out there. So until the next edition of Classic Books, I'll take your leave. I'm your host, Muqtada Khan.